Well, hi everybody, and welcome to the conversation. I'm here with our dear friend Sequoyah Thornton. So, Koya, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we've had the joy, obviously, of knowing you for years and watching your journey, and so we're really just excited that you're going to get to share your story. And Koya, for those that don't know you, why don't you just share a little bit about like where you're coming from and how you grew up a little bit?
Okay. I was so blessed to be able to go to a Christian school my entire life. I felt like it really cultivated the friendships that I have now, really got me thinking the way I should be. However, at home, I didn't grow up with my biological father. And coming from a multi-ethnic background, it was really difficult because I felt like I didn't get the full spectrum of culture that I needed to thrive and to know who I was in Jesus.
Hmm.
To look at my kind of background, my mom is Irish and Native, and my dad is Black. So I kind of struggled with being three ethnicities
Yeah.
as one. And going to my Christian school, I felt like there wasn't a lot of minorities represented. And so I had a difficult time growing up because I felt like I couldn't relate to other kids.
Yeah.
Because my mom is so lighter than me, I had kids come up and tell me that that wasn't my real mom, I was
Mm.
adopted. And so it really
Wow.
messed with you because as a elementary kid, you start to believe your friends and the people around you.
Right.
And so I started questioning my mom and my family really.
Wow. So, what was that like, Koya? Like when kids would say things like they would say that's not your real mom, obviously at a young age, like what did you do with that kind of feedback? How did you wear that growing up?
Everything was internalized, honestly. I
Hmm.
didn't think about it out of sight, out of mind, but of course it was there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I want to say middle school that I sat down with my mom and I asked her. And for some reason, it didn't click that your your dad's dark, your mom's light. You're going to be in between, but it didn't register that way. And
Yeah.
so I had to sit down, have a heart to heart with my mom, and ask her, "Am I adopted?" And I would always, growing up, ask her little things, like a little test as a kid.
Yeah.
I would say, Mom, tell me about the day I was born, what was this like? And finally, she was telling me, I'm so sorry, what caused this? And I told her, there's people saying things, my friends, and, we just had a heart to heart, and she explained, and she felt so bad. And I think that's why I didn't want to speak out too, is I didn't want her to feel bad.
Hmm.
But in doing that, I was internalizing things and it kind of spiraled
Yeah.
from there.
So what was that like for you, Coy? Even like you said, growing up in a house where, like you said, your mom is Irish and Native and your dad is Black. Was that stuff like was that talked about in your house? Was that not talked about? How did you kind of experience that tension just with even in like your family system growing up?
Okay, so it wasn't really talked about my Black culture. It
Hmm.
was mainly my Native and my white, but specifically my Native. We would go to gathering, family gun. I can't even speak. Family functions. We would go to powwows. We would eat traditional food, and so I knew that aspect. My grandma would go to the chapel. She would speak. So I knew my Native culture. Irish culture, we didn't talk so much about, but we were definitely proud.
Okay.
It was my Black culture that I felt like was, in my perception, shunned a little bit. And
Hmm.
so, in hearing that and seeing that, I felt ashamed of who I was.
Yeah. Now, growing up, like when you say that the Black culture was shunned, like what kind of things were said, or like what happened along the way that you began to get that vibe that like, oh, the Black culture part of me isn't as maybe welcomed or talked about? Were things explicitly said growing up?
Yes, I specifically remember some of my family members, I would say, "Oh, I'm part Black," and I would hear, "You're not Black, you're Native." And so, hearing
Hmm.
that, I thought, I was explained that I was this, I see my father, but you're telling me I'm not. So it was difficult hearing that from your family because you believe them, you trust them, but when they tell you you're
Yeah.
not something, when you feel like you are, because I felt different. So I knew I wasn't just two things, I was three. It just wasn't taught
Yeah.
to me. Even with my features, with my hair, I would try to blend in as much as I could. I would straighten it, I would brush it, just to do anything to look less mixed, I guess, look like the
Yeah.
dominant culture that was around me. I tried to change so much of who I was,
Right.
and
So,
I felt like it wasn't taught that you need to be proud of this. You need to be
hmm,
proud of how you do look.
right. So you mentioned obviously growing up, like going to a Christian school. Now, as far as the community you were around, did you grow up around like mainly white community, mainly black community, mainly native community? Who were you predominantly around just kind of growing up?
I think elementary it was a little bit more diverse. I had a couple of black friends, but it was predominantly white for the most part.
Okay. So for
And
you,
even
yeah.
the black children that I did saw, they had both their parents. So that was another layer
Oh,
added
okay.
to it because they had that representation at home and I didn't have that. So it was difficult. I definitely envied them and their family structure.
Yeah. So even as you're growing up, just as a little girl into junior high, high school kind of world, um, like were you aware of the tension that was there, or did you just always kind of feel like off or like you didn't fit? How would you describe kind of how you then would have described that turmoil?
I didn't feel any tension. I just felt not even resentment. It was just confusion, I think.
Mm,
Because it wasn't racial issues weren't talked about in my home. So I didn't know there's this whole black and white thing going on. But when I do go to school, I feel it. I feel just confused, I guess.
yeah.
Because I would be told you're not really black, but I was too dark to be white. And then the native at school was completely forgotten about. So I was definitely
Hmm.
so mixed up.
Yeah. Now, growing up around like even just like growing up around the church, within church culture, was that ever something that was addressed, or like kind of just how did your faith journey evolve throughout that season for you growing up?
So growing up, I did go to church up until probably middle school. So I don't really have any solid memories of it being taught.
Yeah.
Really school that was allowing me to grow my faith because I did come from a faith home,
Yeah.
but we didn't go to church. We didn't go to Bible study. So it was definitely school that was helping me
Yeah.
grow in my faith. And I felt like at the school we didn't talk about racial issues as much. So that was definitely difficult for me. And as I got older, starting to go to church, I noticed that as well. And I felt like I was missing that from a church. I was missing, how you're created ethnically as a gift. I never got that growing up.
Mm.
Or I didn't get that in the church when I did go.
Yeah. So like, did you even feel, even though it's just like your friends, like the way you're ethnically put together, the way God's designed you? So was that just not ever part of the conversation? Did you always feel like this isn't really something we can talk about? What was that like, just even among peers?
And we didn't really talk about it. There were some comments made growing up that really did hurt me. And that kind of internalized more.
Mm.
So my friends, as I got older, were predominantly white. And even the friend that I did have that was black, she wasn't stereotypically black. So she would be told, you act white. She moved on to a public school, got the same thing at her public school. So I knew I wasn't alone.
Right.
But we didn't talk about it. We didn't really have pride in it, I guess to say. We
Yeah.
didn't wear it on our sleeve, but it was definitely, it wasn't the center of our friendship, which I'm grateful about.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I wish it was a little bit more emphasized.
Hmm.
And that's on my part too, because I was too young to even realize what was going on.
Yeah.
So
You weren't even aware of it, obviously.
I wasn't aware at all.
Yeah.
I knew I felt something, but I didn't know what, and I couldn't describe it yet.
Now, when you say, like, just for the learning curve of anyone listening, right, that might identify to your story a bit, like when you say your friend and even yourself weren't like stereotypically black, what would you put under that umbrella? Like, what would be the markers in the world you're growing up in that would either be stereotypically black or not?
I think how you talk, there's definitely in a stereotypical opinion where you sound less intelligent. Also, beauty standards, I believe, with hair. I know growing up, I didn't see a lot of people with curly hair in the media or anything at school. And so I definitely was taught, straight hair is better.
Mm.
Even when I did straighten my hair at school, I would always get the comments, oh, I like your hair better straight, or I like your hair straight. I don't like it this way. And so again, it was just little comments that added up.
Right.
Also, I think culturally music, my growing up at home, I wasn't allowed to listen to secular music. So I didn't really know the culture. I didn't know, specific sayings. I didn't know what was what was savvy at the time.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of stereotypically describes. Also, sports. I was into sports. I did play certain sports that are stereotypical, but I never did it because of that. I did it
Yeah.
because I wanted to. So I definitely didn't go towards the way that I was supposed to,
Yeah.
according to what people think about Black people.
So let me ask you this, Corey. Like you mentioned, people saying, "Oh, I like your hair better straight." You
Hmm.
mentioned even something stereotypical, that the way you talk, stereotypical black would be in the messages you've received less intelligent, right? Which is the language you used. You even just mentioned playing stereotypically black sports. So
Hmm.
growing up, even that very idea, what was that like? Obviously, you mentioned growing up in a predominantly white space, but you've also got a black father, and now you're hearing these messages that seem to communicate that being stereotypically black is somehow categorized. What was that
Hmm.
like for you, kind of receiving those messages along the way?
I just felt like I was being who I wasn't supposed to be. I felt like people expected people that looked like me to be a certain way, and I wasn't. And I was accepted for that, but I knew I felt off. I felt kind of hurt because I was expected to be one way and I didn't fit that mold.
Hmm.
I acted white according to other people. So
Yeah.
it
Now,
was difficult.
did you? Okay, so even in that reality, like, did you feel pressure when you're around certain groups to be more white or around certain groups to be more black? Did you feel like torn then in that regard, having to please whoever you were around?
I did it until college.
Okay.
So I went to Grand Canyon University my first semester, and amazingly, I had basically all minority friends, and it was amazing. It was the first time I felt like I fit in somewhere, that I can
Mm,
look a certain way and be accepted, and I was praised for that, and I felt amazing because I never felt that before.
wow.
Um, I felt bad being stereotypical around them, and they would make little comments, but they never made me feel different. They included me for the first time. I felt like I fit in
Yeah.
somewhere.
What was
All my
that?
friends were brown. It was freeing, if anything.
Mm,
I felt like I finally had a community. I could talk about things and they would understand.
yeah.
So it was really nice.
Corey, growing up in the environment where, like you said, for the first time in college, you were around like friends of minority ethnic groups, and you just mentioned it was kind of the first time you felt like you were included or invited in, right? So when it comes to your faith and your walk with Jesus along the way, what was that transition like, going from a world where your identity in a sense wasn't talked about, right? There was confusion, and then now you go to this space where all of a sudden people kind of look like you, your skin complexion is much more similar to those around you. What was that like in your walk with Jesus, transitioning those worlds?
I think growing up, I really emphasized a fatherly relationship with God. And that really, I felt, stabilized me and kept me going. But as I gotten older, I realized that how I'm made is unique, and it's supposed to reach people and it's supposed to not reach people. And I
Mm,
felt when I learned that it took pressure off me because I felt like I had to please everyone. I felt like I had to be what everyone wanted me to be.
yeah.
But I realized that God made me one way, and it was freeing when I realized, you fit in somewhere. You might not fit in everywhere, but God has a plan. God knows what he's doing, and he's uniquely created you.
So as you traverse those relationships with peers, relationships with people in college, as you begin to discover more about who God's uniquely made you to be, describe some more of that journey. What's kind of happened in the last few years as you've just come in touch with more of the design and what God's doing in you?
Yeah. Honestly, it's hard to admit it, but coming to terms with everything, I felt more resentment towards the white community recently growing up. I wanted to be white, and as I've gotten older the past few years, I really resented the people group. Um, I think because just hearing little comments from multiple people, I thought everyone thought of me that way. Even one of my friends making hurtful comments, I thought everyone sees me that way if my friend does. Someone
Yeah.
that I love, someone that I trust. Um, there was a comment made about beauty standards. So now, even to this day, it affects me. I think, if I walk in a predominantly white space, no one's gonna think I'm worthy. It's definitely messed with me, and it's turned into resentment. It's turned into anger. It's turned where I don't want to have white friends.
Yeah.
I don't want to be around that space because I felt like I wasn't wanted when I was, but I felt like through the messages that I was told I wasn't wanted or I wasn't seen.
Yeah.
and it's turned into resentment. And it's hard because my family's white. Half of my family's white.
Yeah.
So I feel like going around them, I just feel different too.
How do you reconcile that resentment, Koya? Like what like is that's now coming to the surface in this last season for you? What do you do with that resentment? How does that sit with you?
I haven't really talked about it much. I've tried with my mom, but unfortunately, I feel like there's a misunderstanding there.
Hmm.
So it's definitely hard to talk about it when she's experienced discrimination herself. But I feel like she doesn't racially look it, and so she doesn't feel what I feel every day. You
Mm.
know, I used to go into a space and look and see how many people looked like me. And this was 12 years, 11 years old. I would look around to see how many people look like me versus how many don't. Even at a young age, I noticed things like that. I never felt comfortable in my skin. And so I think as I get older, I've been praying more. I've been trying to find a way to deal with the resentment, but so far it's still there. So I'm really trying though.
Yeah. So I think even, I think the beauty, Koya, of your journey is even as the Spirit's revealing, there's that resentment. Like the beauty is he'll now begin to walk you through those emotions. If you were to try to give some voice to it, especially I think for those of you that might listen or watch this, that might connect to your story, right? They might think, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I felt this entire time. Could you describe, if you could put language to the resentment? Like, what do you resent about the white community, which I would be a part of? If you were to put language to the resentment, what do you realize now that you resent?
I think it's what I perceive as a lack of understanding.
Mm.
I feel as if the white community doesn't realize that this is a daily thing. And when you see, especially the media, I feel like it's just not the same being represented wise. I feel like when the black community does speak, or really any minority does speak, they're put on the back burner. They're perceived as angry. They're perceived as, rebellious. And I feel like if the white community just sat down, just listened to just some of the things that minorities feel, I think there would be a little bit of a connection. But I feel like it's a lack of understanding and even trying to just be open-minded and realize that I might be a part of the problem, but I'm willing to listen.
Yeah.
So I can fix it.
What do you think, Koya, as you're now in sort of your college years, right? You're becoming a young adult. You're learning to traverse all these sort of new conversations that may have always, the emotions were always there, but like you said, now you're having language to talk about these things for the first time. When you think about just where we are as a culture, and when you think about even just being a Christian, being a member of the church, how do we actually start going after these kind of conversations? Like, what would you want to see happen along the way, or what do you think needs to happen?
I feel like if people of color got to speak more, I'm not sure how that would look maybe in a church setting, but I think if they're given the opportunity that they should, I think it starts with conversation really and looking at someone else's perception. I don't know how that would go about because I know not everyone's going to want to speak.
Yeah.
I think just giving them a platform and making them feel safe.
Yeah. Like, go ahead. So a safe place would be the key, you're saying?
Yeah. Because I definitely didn't feel like I could say that growing up. Even in my family, I felt like, they see me as one way, but I a few different things. So I wanted them to see that it's intersection of different things. It's not just one issue, but it's everything really.
Yeah. What, in your mind, what do you think it takes to create those kind of safe spaces where people can be free to be themselves? Like how do we actually foster that?
I'm not sure. I think for me though, just listening to me and not getting any judgment. I think just listening. That's what I personally take.
Yeah.
I would speak, I would hear, oh, but it's not this way. But I feel it though. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean that I don't feel it or it's not an issue for you, but it is for me.
Right. So when people would say things to you like that, like when you would share your story, when somebody would say, oh, it's not really like that or whatever, what was that like for you to hear comments like that?
Oh, it hurts so bad because it was from a family member before. I tried to speak about how I felt and one of the family members said, oh, you're fine, like it's fine. And it hurt even more because that's someone you trust.
Yeah.
So I realized that it's not even just outsiders, it's your own family. That if they don't grow up with your experiences, they won't understand. But I felt like in the moment they weren't trying to understand. It was just brushed off. I feel like a lot of things are, and that's the biggest hurt is when you're just pushed to the side.
Yeah. Are you to this day, as you're uncovering some of these things and you're learning about some of these conversations to be had, as you think about those messages growing up, now at your age with what you're going through now, like how do you think about these things as you reflect back and realize what you're at now? What's the thought process like for you these days?
Just learning to forgive, to be honest. I feel like I processed everything. I feel like it makes sense why I felt the way I did. I think it's just forgiveness and realizing that not every person is going to look at you different, or every person is going to even care that you do look different.
Yeah.
Of course, they're going to see you, but it's not going to be a big deal. It's not going to make you different. It's
Yeah.
just going to make you you. And I think that that's the biggest thing, is realizing that not everyone is going to be hateful, not everyone's going to be hurtful. And I don't even think it's intentional, which is the biggest thing. It's not intentional. It's not always malicious. It's just lack of understanding, just ignorance.
Yeah.
So I think forgiveness, knowing that not everyone is trying to hurt you, not being so defensive.
Right. Now, you mentioned a couple things in the conversation, Koyo, right, where you became aware that there's a resentment, right, that is there towards the white community. You also just mentioned that in the process you're learning to forgive. So, for those who might be able to relate to those two things that seem to be in tension, what are you learning about those two words as you hold those in opposition, resentment and forgiveness? How are those kind of converging for you in this season?
Through prayer, through talking with one of my friends that experienced similar things, I think gathering people that understand you is really important. I realized that by not talking, I was isolating myself more, but by being in a community, I was healing. And I think that's so important, to gather people that know exactly what you're talking about when you say, "Hey, I felt this way," or I felt like they perceived me this way," and to see I've gotten that too. I think that's really important, to be around community.
Yeah. Is that something now that you're getting to then experience, and as you're experiencing that, how do you feel like you're growing in the process now as you're becoming the woman that God made you to be? Unpack that a little bit more. What's going on for you in this season as you're learning to talk through those things?
It's really made me appreciate who I am. I've never been proud of how I was. But now that I have gotten older, I've realized a lot of things. I'm so proud to be me. And I feel like when you truly are proud, you can see that in other people. I know we oftentimes look at other people as a mirror of how we feel about ourselves. And I feel like the more that I accept myself, my culture, I can do that with other people too, because I realize that they go through similar things as well.
Yeah.
I think it's really realizing that when you realize things about yourself, you realize about other people too.
Mm-hmm.
You're able to forgive them, you're able to understand them. Just give them a break if they're coming off a certain way, because we don't know what they've been through. So it's really me just learning to realize, to just listen to people, because they've been through things too. And you're not the only one that's experienced things before.
Right.
Yeah.
If you were to say to anybody that's, in a similar stage as you, maybe growing up in a biracial home, right, with multiple ethnic backgrounds, and especially maybe in an arena maybe where it's not talked about, how would you encourage people that are maybe in your similar shoes? Let's start with first those that can relate to what you're talking about. How would you encourage them? Maybe they're a young girl as well in high school, or a young man feeling those same emotions. What would you say to them?
I would first tell them to feel everything they're feeling, not to internalize anything, because that's what I did. And I feel like that put things on the back burner. It made things worse for me. I feel like if you're open about what you're feeling, that's the beginning, is just to be vulnerable. But it's really difficult. Again, I think we need to create a safe space, but I think we need to be vulnerable. I think we need to seek out individuals that can understand and relate to us.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I would challenge them to really look at how God plays a part in all of this. If I didn't have God, I would be so lost. I would feel like I really didn't fit anywhere.
Yeah.
But being in the community of God, I feel like there's a specific purpose to what I've been through, and that's all playing a part into a greater plan. And I wouldn't be able to reach people if I didn't feel it myself, if I didn't experience it. So I would tell them to definitely realize that God is doing something with that pain, that he has a plan for it, and it's going to help people later on.
Yeah. Now, are you getting opportunities now as you're becoming aware of some of these things? What are the conversations like around these issues, both with your friends that can relate to your, like, the minority identity, but also with white friends? How are both of those conversations going these days as you are learning to talk about all this stuff?
Yeah, so with my minority friends, we basically just talk about our experiences. There's a lot of frustration that circle the conversation, but there's also that community where we feel like we can relate. And then with one of my right friends, actually, at the school I'm at now, it's really interesting because she feels the same way that I do. So her being white, she resents white people because of how she's seen people be treated before. And she's even mentioned, or actually two of my friends have mentioned, I don't even like white people and I'm white. I'm so ashamed of the things that do go on. So even God bringing them in my life, I realized that not everyone's going to feel, they'll feel a way that I think they do against me. They've really accepted me and they've acknowledged me and they've seen it and they're ashamed of their own people group. So I think it's a really positive thing for me, realizing that not everyone, means anything by the way they are.
Yeah. So with what you're learning, Koya, as you're on your journey with Jesus and you're getting counsel and you're growing in who he's made you to be, what are you learning about the heart of God in the midst of our shame, right? So you mentioned you had felt shame growing up in different ways. You just mentioned other friends that felt shame for different things. As you're learning about Jesus, what do you think his heart is for us as we learn to come in touch with some of that shame and face some of these harder things that might be easier to not talk about, especially in church? What do you think God's heart is in the midst of it?
I think he just wants everyone to be reconciled. I think it really hurts him to see how he uniquely designed people to be able to reach people, to be torn down for that. And I know I really respect Jesus. Now that I see his story, I realize that he saw other minorities and he saw them and he was able to help them. He was able to relate to them. And I think that's really positive about Jesus.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, it does.
He was able to reach people.
What do you think it is, Coy, about the way Jesus sees people that, and as Christians, as his Holy Spirit dwells within us, what is it about the way Jesus sees people that he would see people in the way you're describing?
Well, he sees what they've gone through. He sees their ethnicity and realizes what comes with that. And I think that's really important, is because when we see people, we need to realize the history of what has gone on with them, like the generational trauma that comes with being a certain people group. Mm-hmm. And he sees that and he's able to validate that.
Yeah. Now, when you mention like the generational trauma, right? So let's just take you, right? You've got Black history as part of your story. You also mentioned you've got Native American history as part of your story. As you've gotten a little bit older and learned, because I know you're describing before when we were chatting on the phone, you've learned more about history and what both groups of people, both the Black community and Native community, what they've gone through in American history. What's it been like as you've discovered, even just historically, what some of your ancestors have gone through and people that are in your family line? What's that been like as you discovered aware of before?
Yeah, just a lot of respect. A lot of just so thankful that they went through the things that I didn't have to so that I could be here. When I look back now and I wasn't proud to be who I was, I realized my family, past ancestors, have been through so much for me to be here now. And I didn't realize that. I didn't look at history. I never thought of it as a way to connect with people. So now that I see the history, I just have so much appreciation that they paved the way for me. Just like I'll pave the way for future generations. Just a lot of respect, honestly. Really, really, just admiration for them, like people like my grandma going through what she's been through. I think it's really special to hear those stories and to remember them.
Yeah. Now, when you mention your grandma, do you mean grandma, Native American grandma?
Yes.
Okay. So as she has shared Native American history with you, what are some things you remember from her stories along the way that you've taken and thought, I'm so glad I know that now, that that's part of my family's history. Does a thought or a memory come to mind, or something she shared with you along the way?
Um, well, she actually had to go to one of those native boarding schools because
Mm,
at the time a lot of natives were forced into the boarding school. However, she actually wasn't forced because she was later on in history. So she wasn't forced. She went there and she really enjoyed it. So
mm,
hearing that not everything that's perceived to be bad was necessarily bad for each individual. She thrived in her boarding school. She loved it. But also hearing before her boarding school, she was discriminated against. The
mm.
kids wouldn't let her drink out of a certain water fountain. She had to drink out of the hose with the colored people. Hearing that, I haven't experienced anything nearly as painful. But even hearing that she's been through something that I can relate to, just feeling different, I think is really special that we're able to relate to our ancestors.
Yeah. What would you say, Koya, for those, maybe for a minute, because I think you've got a gift to give both people that are your age, but also parents that are raising kids who are going to be also ethnically diverse, growing up in a mixed household. Like, if if you being at your age could encourage parents that are raising kids just like you, what would you want parents to know? Because obviously it's got to be scary, I imagine, growing up as a kid, looking at your skin color, knowing there could be questions. But I can't imagine, I'm assuming that's got to be scary for parents that also know this is not an easy thing to traverse. So what would you say to parents that are raising kids that are in a racially diverse house?
Yeah, so my mom definitely went through it. When she would take me to the mall, there's a specific story where, a lady came up to her and thought she was my nanny or my family. So definitely experienced, was that really your kid? So I think hearing from her, what she did is, no, this is my baby. She accepted me, embraced me, and I think that's important too. Seeing that as you get older, if people try to point fingers or notice anything that's different racially, just saying, no, that's my child, just claiming them, I think is really important.
Hmm.
And then also, if they do voice an opinion, just to listen. Don't say anything, just let them talk.
Yeah.
And I think it would be really naive for people to think that it's not going on as young as elementary, because it started there for me. I started hearing things right away. So I think realizing that, even young kids, they hear stuff in school. And to just kind of unravel that, talk to your children if you could, I think is really important. If I just was sat down and told this is what's going to happen, you might experience this, I think everything would have been different if I'd been given that talk.
Let me ask you this, Quay. Let's just take, because obviously you know my wife and I, and so let's say we, well, I guess now hypothetically that would make sense. I was trying to think of myself as a white parent that had a mixed child. So if my wife was white, that also wouldn't make any sense. So anyway, let's say we were raising you. Let's just go hypothetical for a second. Like, obviously growing up, because of my skin color, I'm going to be in the majority and in sort of the privileged world just because of the skin color. You're going to be in the minority world, like you said. So what would you say to a parent like me, maybe a white parent who's raising maybe a mixed race child or a child that, like you said, I won't be able to relate to exactly what you're going to feel. I may try. I may want to out of love for you, but I also am not going to actually be able to know exactly what it's like to have your skin color versus mine. So what would you say to a white parent who's raising a child who has a skin color that's darker and is thus going to walk out a different journey than they did? What would you say to a parent like me, maybe?
I think definitely to claim all of their ethnicities to make them realize that each one is important as the other one. Because I didn't have that growing up. There was definitely favoritism towards one side. I think also, which sounds really silly, but beauty standards. I think making them realize that how they are with darker skin is beautiful. Their hair, I feel like if I had that growing up, a lot of things would be different. Just how you feel about yourself, really, and how you see God. Because I didn't see God as one that saw me for my color. I just saw God as, general, just God as a father. But when I really learned who I was and how he designed me, I realized he made me that way for a reason. So I think hearing that it's a purposeful thing would be life-changing for me and definitely for a kid too.
Okay. So let me ask you this one final question, Koya. Let's say you were a part of a church leadership team and you had the authority to make decisions, and you were part of a team that really said, okay, we know the kingdom of God is breaking in. We know that the heart of God is to see the beauty of his beautifully diverse humanity rise to the surface, and we want to celebrate that. What kind of things would you hope to see happen within a church community that would foster, like you mentioned earlier, a safe space where people like yourself could find their voice and find their who God made them to be? What kind of things would you want to see happen if you got to lead a church with a team? Yeah.
I think small group would be really cool. I don't know how that would look about like racially the makeup, but I think definitely just a small space is really cool. A space to just share your story, to be honest. I feel like it would be really beneficial if pastors spoke on it to the whole congregation as well. I don't know if that would look like people sharing their testimony, a video of certain things going on, but I think definitely being culturally aware of what's happening, to not just, come into church on a Sunday and we talk about, whatever passage, which is equally as important, but also to connect it with the real world, to connect it with what people go through every single day.
Yeah. So, Koya, let me ask you, I said that was the last question. Now I have a last question, hearing what you just said. So maybe this is the actual final thing. If you were to speak to young women around the country who are exactly in your shoes, and you could say one thing to them, what would you say?
One thing?
Or maybe two things or three.
Okay. Trying to narrow it down. I think start with God. I think is the biggest thing. I always looked at myself as, of course, a part of God's family, but didn't see myself in the way God saw me. So I think starting with how God views you, how you're uniquely created, and it just stems from there.
Yeah.
Know you are where you can really know yourself. Okay. And for me, that's definitely true. Definitely start with God, though.
Okay. That's awesome. Well, Koya, thank you. I can't thank you enough for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, it was so scary, but
well, it's not easy. So I just appreciate your bravery to share. I know it's a scary thing to share some of those vulnerable things. So thank you for being so open and honest about it. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak about something that, is really big in my life, still is.
Yeah.
But I'm appreciative, so thank you.
Well, I want to encourage you, Koya. I think God's given you a voice to speak, so make sure you speak because you got a lot of good stuff to say, okay?
Thank you.
You bet. All right, well, everybody, until the next conversation, grace and peace.